$180,000. That's what my father announced at my sister Emily's wedding reception, his champagne glass raised high while 400 guests held their breath, waiting to hear exactly how much the Gray family had spent on this fairy tale. Worth every cent, he boomed, his voice carrying across the ballroom at the plaza. Nothing is too much for our daughter's happiness. The applause erupted like thunder. Cameras flashed, capturing Emily's practiced surprise, her hand flying to her chest in that gesture she'd probably rehearsed. Her new husband Daniel pulled her close while Mom cried those perfect tears that didn't mess up her makeup. I clapped too, my palms stinging from the force of pretending this was normal, that watching my parents celebrate spending a fortune on flowers and fireworks didn't feel like salt in a wound that was still bleeding. Because 6 weeks earlier, in their living room in Great Neck, I'd sat on the same couch where I'd done my homework as a teenager and asked for help with something that mattered more than any wedding reception. $90,000 for IVF treatment. My last chance after 3 failed cycles I'd already paid for myself, after my insurance had maxed out, after my savings account had been drained trying to become the one thing I'd wanted since I was old enough to understand what motherhood meant. Dad had looked at me like I'd asked him to fund a vacation to Mars. That's a lot of money for something that might not even work, Kennedy. We can't just throw money away on maybes. But apparently they could throw $180,000 at Emily's one-day party. And call it worth every cent. Standing in that ballroom, watching my sister bask in the glow of being the chosen daughter, I understood with perfect clarity that this wasn't about the money at all. It was about whose dreams deserved funding and whose didn't, whose happiness was worth investing in and whose was called a waste. My name is Kennedy Barnes. I'm 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the understory in Emily's show, present but not prominent, included but not essential, visible only when someone needed to demonstrate they had 2 daughters instead of just one. Look at any family photo from the past 3 decades and you'll see the pattern. Emily dead center, positioned where the eye naturally falls, her smile practiced and perfect. And there, slightly off to the side, sometimes half cut from the frame, that's me, the daughter who learned early that taking up space required permission I was never quite granted. The pattern crystallized early. Emily's acceptance to Harvard arrived in a thick envelope that Dad held like it was made of gold, calling the neighbors to share the news before she'd even finished reading it. My acceptance to Nassau Community College got a "that's nice" honey delivered without eye contact while Dad scrolled through his phone. Christmas mornings told the story in gift-wrapped clarity. Emily unwrapping diamond earrings while I opened practical wool socks. Her receiving a car for graduation while I got a check for $200 with a note that said something to get you started. Her study abroad semester in Paris funded without question while my request for help with textbooks was met with lectures about fiscal responsibility. The family dynamics had settled into roles we all accepted. Dad, Richard Barnes, who'd built a commercial real estate empire and measured love in returns on investment, in things that could be displayed and discussed and used to prove his daughter's worth to other people in his tax bracket. Mom, Catherine, who'd perfected the art of diplomatic silence, whose conflict resolution strategy involved smoothing things over until the problem seemed to disappear, which meant Emily's needs were addressed and mine were categorized as things I should handle on my own. Emily, my older sister by 2 years, who'd somehow always been the star, Ivy League graduate, consultant at McKinsey, engaged to Preston Whitmore, whose family owned half the office buildings in Midtown, polished in that way that comes from never having to choose between looking good and paying rent. And me, the quiet daughter. Dependable Kennedy, who worked as an administrative coordinator at a nonprofit, making $46,000 a year helping run programs I believed in but couldn't quite afford to live on. Living in a 1-bedroom in Astoria where the radiator clanked through winter nights and the building's elevator worked maybe 3 days a week. I showed up to family dinners, remembered birthdays, sent appropriate gifts I couldn't afford, asked polite questions about Emily's promotion or Preston's family yacht or whatever milestone she'd achieved that month. I was reliably present, consistently there, rarely acknowledged. The pattern continued into our 30s. Emily's engagement announcement happened at per se, Dad paying for a tasting menu that cost more than my weekly groceries, so she could reveal the ring Preston had custom designed. My engagement 3 years earlier had been acknowledged with a dinner at Applebee's where Dad had left early for a conference call. My wedding to Marcus had been a backyard ceremony with 50 guests, catered by our friends who ran a food truck, beautiful in its simplicity, but clearly not the kind of event that made Dad's face light up when colleagues asked about his daughter's lives. Emily's wedding planning had started 18 months before the date, with consultants and planners and a budget that kept expanding every time I heard Mom discuss it. "We want to give her something special," Mom would say, as if my backyard ceremony hadn't been special, as if love could be measured in flower arrangements and crystal chandeliers. For years, I'd told myself this was just how families worked. Parents couldn't fund everything equally. Resources were finite. Emily had always been more ambitious, more successful, more the kind of daughter who required investment. But the emptiness kept growing. Not just the empty space at Christmas where my gifts were practical while hers were precious. Not just the empty acknowledgement in conversations where Emily's achievements were celebrated and mine were summarized with Kennedy's still at the nonprofit as if my career was something I'd never gotten around to. Upgrading. The empty feeling in my chest every time Dad's face transformed when Emily walked into a room, the way it stayed carefully neutral when I arrived. The empty seat at the metaphorical family table where recognition should have been, where pride should have lived, where the message "you matter equally" should have been written but never was. And then came the thing I wanted most in the world, the dream that mattered more than any wedding or career milestone or family validation. I wanted to become a mother. Marcus and I had been trying for 3 years. 3 years of negative pregnancy tests, of appointments with fertility specialists who used words like unexplained infertility and diminished ovarian reserve, of treatment plans that started hopeful and ended expensive. We'd done 3 IVF cycles already, paying out of pocket after insurance maxed out. $28,000 for the first cycle that ended in heartbreak. $32,000 for the second that gave us hope for 6 weeks before miscarriage. $35,000 for the third that never even resulted in a positive test. $95,000. Our savings, gone. My dreams of motherhood, funded by credit cards with interest rates that made me nauseous and weekend side jobs that left me exhausted. The doctor said we had one more realistic shot. One more cycle with a protocol adjustment that might work, that offered genuine hope, that would cost another $90,000 we didn't have. I'd sat in that medical office, looking at treatment plans I couldn't afford, and for the first time in my adult life, I'd considered asking my parents for help, not for a wedding or a vacation or anything frivolous, for the chance to become a mother, to bring their grandchild into the world, to build the family Marcus and I had been dreaming about since the day we'd met. I'd rehearsed the conversation 100 times, practiced explaining the success rates, the medical necessity, the fact that this was my last realistic chance before age made even IVF unlikely to succeed. But I kept remembering Emily's Harvard tuition, paid without question. Her study abroad, funded without hesitation. Her engagement ring consultation, where Dad had offered to help out with a sum he'd never specified, but that had resulted in a diamond I couldn't look at without feeling sick about the inequality it represented. Maybe, I'd thought, driving to their house in Great Neck, maybe this time would be different. Maybe asking for something that actually mattered, something about family and legacy and grandchildren, would finally make them see me as worth investing in. I'd convinced myself for years that love wasn't measured in gifts, in checks, in the size of the wedding budget, or the quality of Christmas presents. I'd told myself that Emily's privileges were just circumstances, not commentary on my worth. But deep down, every unspoken comparison had been screaming the truth I'd been too afraid to hear. She is everything, you are nothing. She is the daughter worth investing in. You are the daughter who should be grateful for whatever scraps fall from the family table. The fertility clinic on the Upper East Side had walls so white they hurt to look at, the kind of sterile brightness that felt designed to make hope look clinical instead of desperate. Dr. Sarah Chen sat across from Marcus and me, her hands folded on a desk covered in pamphlets about treatments we'd already tried and couldn't afford to try again. "I'll be direct," she said, her voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone who delivered bad news professionally. "Your ovarian reserve is declining faster than we'd like. At 32, you're testing like someone 5 years older. If you want a biological child, we need to act now." Now. The word hung in the air like a deadline I couldn't meet. "What are we looking at?" Marcus asked, his hand tightening around mine with enough pressure to leave marks. Dr. Chen pulled out a treatment plan that looked like a prison sentence written in medical terminology and dollar signs. One more cycle with an aggressive protocol. Higher medication doses, additional monitoring, genetic testing of embryos. Total cost would be approximately $90,000. The brochure she slid across the desk felt like it weighed 100 pounds. I gripped it until the glossy paper crumpled. my fingerprints leaving sweat marks on images of smiling families that looked nothing like the desperate people sitting in her office wondering how to fund a dream that biology was making increasingly expensive. Without insurance coverage? I asked, already knowing the answer. Your plan maxed out after the third cycle. This would be entirely out of pocket. She paused, her expression softening in that way that precedes words nobody wants to hear. Kennedy, I need you to understand, this is likely your last realistic chance. After 33, success rates drop significantly. We're looking at a narrow window. My heartbeat became louder than her voice, a drumming in my ears that sounded like time running out, like biology betraying me, like 90,000 reasons why wanting to be a mother wasn't enough when your body required medical intervention that cost more than most people's annual salary. We left that appointment with a folder full of paperwork we couldn't afford to act on and a deadline that wouldn't wait for us to figure out how to fund our future. Marcus held me in the parking garage while I cried against his shoulder, his own tears falling into my hair, both of us understanding that wanting something desperately doesn't make it financially possible. 2 weeks later, I sat in my parents' kitchen in Great Neck, the same room where I'd eaten breakfast before school, where I'd done homework at the granite counter, where family decisions had always been made over coffee that cost more per pound than I spent on groceries in a week. Mom was arranging flowers in a vase, her movements precise and elegant. Dad sat reading the Wall Street Journal, his reading glasses perched on his nose. Emily was visiting for brunch, scrolling through her phone with a latte that had probably cost $8 and contained more foam than actual coffee. Normal. Everything looked so normal, like this was just another family gathering instead of the moment I was about to beg for help with something that mattered more than anything I'd ever asked for. I need to talk to you about something important, I said, my voice coming out smaller than I'd intended. Dad looked up from his newspaper. Mom set down her flowers. Emily kept scrolling, but I could tell she was listening by the way her thumb had stopped moving. I pulled out the folder Dr. Chen had given me, spreading the treatment plan across the kitchen table like evidence in a trial where I was pleading for my future. Marcus and I have been trying to have a baby for 3 years. We've done 3 IVF cycles that didn't work. The doctor says we have one more realistic chance, but it costs $90,000. The silence that followed felt heavier than the words I'd just spoken. Mom's face shifted into that careful neutrality she'd perfected, not quite sympathetic but not quite dismissive. Dad's expression hardened into something that looked like he was calculating numbers that wouldn't add up favorably. That's a lot of money, he said finally, setting down his newspaper with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested he'd already decided his answer. I know, but this is my chance to become a mother. Our chance to give you a grandchild. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't. Kennedy, Dad interrupted, his voice carrying that tone of paternal authority that had ended arguments throughout my childhood. That's not an investment. That's gambling on biology. $90,000 for something that might not even work? That's not responsible. The word investment landed like a slap. Emily's Harvard tuition had been an investment. Her study abroad had been an investment. Her wedding planning budget that kept expanding every time I heard about it was apparently an investment too. But my chance at motherhood was gambling. The success rate is 43% with this protocol, I said, hating how my voice was shaking. That's not gambling, that's medicine. Mom finally spoke, her words gentle in that way that makes cruelty sound like kindness. Sweetheart, have you considered that maybe this is the universe telling you something? Some women aren't meant to be mothers. It's not a failure. It's just acceptance. The universe telling me something, as if my fertility struggles were cosmic messages instead of medical conditions that could be treated if I could afford the treatment. I'm meant to be a mother, I said, tears starting to blur the treatment plan I'd spread across their expensive granite counter. I know I am. I just need help getting there. Emily looked up from her phone, her face wearing an expression that might have been pity if it wasn't quite so dismissive. Not everything's meant to happen, Ken. Maybe it's time to accept that and move on. There are other ways to find fulfillment. Other ways to find fulfillment. Like my dream of having a child was equivalent to wanting a hobby or a career change, something replaceable and optional rather than a longing that had been living in my chest since I was old enough to understand what family meant. So that's it? I asked, looking between the 3 of them. You won't help? Dad folded his newspaper with the same precision Mom had used arranging flowers. We can't fund every request that comes our way, Kennedy. Emily's wedding is already stretching our budget. We have to make practical choices. Practical choices. Emily's wedding. which I'd heard was budgeted at over $150,000 and climbing, was practical. My $90,000 chance at motherhood was impractical. They didn't just refuse. They declared my dream unworthy, my body's longing for life dismissed as frivolous compared to flowers and photographers, and a party that would last one night while I'd spend the rest of my life wondering about the child I couldn't afford to have. I gathered my folder, my hands shaking as I shoved papers back into a plan I'd never be able to execute. I understand, I said, though I didn't. I understood that some daughters were worth investing in and some were supposed to accept what biology and budgets dictated. Walking out of that kitchen felt like walking out of more than just their house. It felt like walking out of the family story they'd been writing. The one where Emily got champagne toasts and I got lectures about acceptance. But they'd taught me something valuable that morning. Something I'd carry with me through everything that came next. That sometimes the people who should support your dreams are the first ones to call them gambling. And sometimes you have to find other players willing to bet on your future when family folds before the cards are dealt. 9 months after my parents refused to help fund my last chance at motherhood, Emily's wedding invitations arrived in cream-colored envelopes, so thick they felt weighted with the money that had been spent on them. Mr. and Mrs. Richard Barnes request the honor of your presence at what would become the most expensive party I'd ever witnessed. The venue was the Pierre, because apparently the plaza wasn't quite exclusive enough. 300 guests, because Emily's social circle required witnesses to her coronation. A budget that had started at $150,000 and had somehow expanded to $180,000 by the time I heard Mom discussing final payments with the wedding planner. Twice what they'd told me they couldn't afford to help with. Twice my chance at becoming a mother, spent on flowers that would die and a dress that would be worn once. I'd spent those 9 months working 2 jobs. My nonprofit coordinator position during the day and weekend catering gigs that left me exhausted but slightly less broke. Marcus and I had started a GoFundMe that raised $8,000 from friends and strangers who believed our dream deserved funding even if my family didn't. We'd applied for medical loans with interest rates that made me nauseous. We were still $40,000 short of what we needed, and my ovarian reserve was declining with every month that passed while Emily picked out cake flavors and argued about whether the ice sculptures should be swans or doves. The wedding day arrived in late September. One of those perfect fall afternoons that looked like it had been ordered specifically for the occasion. The Pierre's ballroom had been transformed into something from a magazine spread about weddings that normal people don't have, crystal chandeliers that had been brought in specifically for the event, floral arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly rent, place settings so elaborate I wasn't sure which fork to use for which course. I'd been assigned to table 19. Tucked in a corner with distant cousins I'd met maybe twice. Emily and Preston sat on an elevated platform at the front of the ballroom, literally looking down on the rest of us, surrounded by their wedding party wearing designer dresses that had required professional fittings. The ceremony had been everything Instagram dreams are made of. Emily floated down the aisle in a Vera Wang gown that had required 3 fittings and cost more than a car. Preston waited at an altar decorated with white roses that had been flown in from Ecuador because apparently local flowers weren't special enough. A string quartet played music I didn't recognize, but that sounded expensive. Mom cried those perfect tears that didn't mess up her makeup. Dad walked Emily down the aisle with the pride of a man presenting his finest work. The priest's words about love and commitment felt rehearsed, delivered to an audience that had come more for the spectacle than the marriage. The reception exceeded even the ceremony's excess. Cocktail hour featured a raw bar that probably cost what I made in a week. Dinner was a 5-course meal with wine pairings selected by someone whose job title was sommelier. The band had played at actual celebrity weddings, which Mom had mentioned to me 3 separate times, as if I needed reminding that Emily's celebration was worth more than my fertility. Dad's toast came during dessert, after the champagne had been flowing for hours and inhibitions had lowered enough that people would applaud statements they might question sober. He stood with a microphone, his tuxedo perfect, his face flushed with alcohol and paternal satisfaction. Behind him, a screen showed photos of Emily through the years, every achievement, every milestone, every moment that had been deemed worthy of preserving. Not a single photo included me. To Emily and Preston, he began, his voice amplified to reach every corner of the ballroom. Tonight represents not just a marriage, but the culmination of 34 years of raising a daughter the right way. The right way. The implication hung in the air like smoke, that there was a wrong way and perhaps I was evidence of it. $180,000, he continued, and I watched 300 faces register that number, with expressions ranging from admiration to envy to shock. Some might say that's excessive. But I say it's the Barnes family standard. When you do things right, cost is irrelevant. The ballroom erupted in applause. Guests whistled, glasses clinked, cameras flashed, capturing this moment of generosity that had been built on my exclusion. Then his eyes found me at table 19, tucked in the corner with the relatives nobody knew what to do with, and something in his expression shifted. "Some daughters give us legacy," he said, his glass raised toward the elevated platform where Emily sat glowing. "Others," he paused, turning to look directly at me, "must learn to applaud from the audience." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel exactly, more like nervous acknowledgement that someone had said something uncomfortable but probably true. 300 people watching me absorbed the message that I was the daughter whose role was witnessing Emily's achievements rather than creating my own. My chest collapsed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but internally, that feeling when you realize the people who are supposed to love you equally have been ranking you your entire life, and you've finally fallen low enough that they'll say it out loud at a party that cost twice what you needed to have a child. The string quartet swelled into something classical and expensive, the kind of music that fills space so completely there's no room for individual voices. The violins drowned out whatever response I might have made, erasing me as effectively as Dad's toast had just dismissed me. Emily beamed on her elevated platform, her Vera Wang gown catching light from chandeliers that cost more than I'd make in 5 years. Preston pulled her close for photos that would be shared on social media with captions about family and love and celebration. And I sat at table 19, applauding on cue like a trained audience member, watching my family spend twice my last chance at motherhood on a party that would be forgotten by next month, understanding with perfect clarity that this wasn't about the money at all. It was about whose dreams deserved funding and whose didn't, whose happiness was worth $180,000 and whose was worth exactly nothing. They'd called my fertility treatment gambling, but they'd just spent twice that amount on flowers and fireworks and a dress that would be worn once. The difference wasn't risk, it was value. And they'd made it clear which daughter's life was worth investing in, and which daughter's role was providing the applause. The morning after Emily's wedding, I woke up in my Astoria apartment with champagne-soaked humiliation still fresh and a clarity that felt like breaking through water after being held under too long. If my family wouldn't give me a chance at motherhood, I'd build one myself. The video I recorded that afternoon was shaky, filmed on my phone propped against a stack of books on my kitchen counter. My face was bare, my eyes still swollen from crying the night before, my voice cracking as I tried to explain why I was asking strangers for help my own family had refused to give. "My name is Kennedy Barnes. I'm 32 years old, and I've been trying to have a baby for 3 years." The words came out raw, unpolished, nothing like the practice speeches Emily had given at her reception. "I've done 3 IVF cycles that didn't work. I have one more chance before my age makes even medical intervention unlikely to succeed." I explained the cost, $90,000 that insurance wouldn't cover. I explained the timeline, a narrow window that was closing faster than I could save. I explained what it felt like to want motherhood so desperately that you'd beg your parents for help and watch them spend twice that amount on your sister's wedding instead. "I'm not asking for charity," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I'm asking for a chance. If you've ever wanted something so badly that you'd do anything to make it happen, if you've ever felt invisible to the people who should see you most clearly, please help me prove that wanting something matters, that dreams don't require family approval to deserve funding." I uploaded the video to YouTube, shared it on GoFundMe, posted it to every platform I could think of despite the vulnerability that felt like stripping naked in public. Then I went to my catering shift and tried not to check my phone every 5 minutes. The donations started small. $10 from someone named Sarah who wrote, "I see you." 20 from a username I didn't recognize, with a message that said, "Keep fighting." 50 from a woman who shared her own fertility journey in a comment that made me cry into the industrial sink where I was washing champagne flutes for someone else's celebration. The money trickled in like rain in a drought, not enough to solve the problem immediately, but enough to water hope I'd been afraid to acknowledge. $5, 20, 15, 100 from someone who understood that strangers sometimes believe in your dreams more than blood does. Marcus and I added third jobs. He drove for Uber after his accounting firm shifts. I picked up weekend shifts at a coffee shop, serving lattes to people who'd never had to calculate whether they could afford both rent and groceries. We lived on pasta and whatever vegetables were marked down at the grocery store, Every dollar saved another brick in the foundation we were building from nothing. The IVF protocol started before we'd reached our full goal. Dr. Chen had offered a payment plan that would let us begin treatment with $70,000 and pay the rest over 6 months. The interest rate made me nauseous, but waiting made me more sick. The hormone injections became my evening ritual. I'd sit on the bathroom floor of our tiny apartment, pinching the soft skin of my abdomen, pushing the needle in with hands that shook from exhaustion and determination. Purple bruises bloomed across my stomach like violent flowers, a garden of pain that I hoped would grow into something beautiful. Marcus would find me there some nights, sitting on cold tile with medication vials scattered around me like evidence of hope, and he'd hold me while I cried about needles and numbers and the family that had chosen flowers over my future. The online support groups became my lifeline. Women I'd never meet in person who understood what it meant to inject yourself with hormones while working multiple jobs, to watch your savings drain while everyone else seemed to get pregnant by accident, to want motherhood so desperately that you'd mortgage your future for a 43% chance. You're not alone, they'd write in forums I read at 2 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come and fear felt overwhelming. Keep going. Your baby is worth fighting for. The crowdfunding campaign grew slowly but steadily. Strangers sharing my video, adding their own stories about fertility struggles and family rejection, creating a community of people who believed my dream deserved funding even if my parents didn't. 8 months after Emily's wedding, 9 months after my parents had refused to help, I logged into the bank account we'd created specifically for IVF savings. The number that appeared made me blink, certain I was reading it wrong, that exhaustion had scrambled my ability to process information. 9,347 元. Not from my parents. Not from Emily's wedding budget that could have funded my treatment twice over. From strangers who'd donated $5 and $10 and $20. From friends who'd shared my story. From Marcus working 18-hour days. From me serving coffee to people who'd never know they were funding someone's last chance at motherhood. I called Dr. Chen's office with hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I have the money, I said, my voice breaking on words that felt like miracle and terror combined. I can schedule the cycle. The embryo transfer happened on a Tuesday morning in April, in the same sterile white room where Dr. Chen had delivered so much bad news over the past 3 years. This time felt different. Not because the medical procedure was different, but because everything leading to this moment had been built by me instead of given by people who'd decided I wasn't worth investing in. Good luck, Dr. Chen said as I lay on the table afterward, following the protocol that required 30 minutes of stillness. You've worked incredibly hard for this. Hard. That was the word my family had never used about my fertility journey, the acknowledgement that this wasn't gambling or frivolity or something I should gracefully accept. This was work, the hardest work I'd ever done, built from strangers' kindness and my own refusal to let family rejection define what I deserved. 2 weeks later, I took the pregnancy test in the bathroom of our apartment, Marcus waiting outside the door because we'd agreed we'd see the results together. The second line appeared faint but unmistakable, a pink shadow that meant cells were dividing, that a baby was growing, that $90,000 and 9 months of fighting had purchased not just a chance but an actual beginning. I opened the door holding the test like it was made of glass. Marcus saw my face and started crying before I could say the words, pulling me close while we both sobbed in the doorway of a bathroom that had witnessed so many negative tests and hormone injections and moments of devastating hope. This wasn't their legacy, this was mine. A miracle scraped together from strangers who'd believed in me and my own refusal to let anyone, not even the family who should have supported me, define what my dreams were worth. My family had spent $180,000 on flowers that died and a dress worn once. I'd spent $90,000 on a life that was just beginning. And I'd learned something they'd never understand. That sometimes the people who refuse to invest in your future are the ones who teach you exactly how strong you are when you're forced to build without them. The sonogram photo arrived on my phone during a Tuesday afternoon shift at the nonprofit, the black and white image grainy but unmistakable. A tiny bean-shaped form with a flickering heartbeat that showed up as a rapid pulse on the screen, measuring exactly 8 weeks and 3 days. My child. Real. Growing. Proof that $90,000 scraped together from strangers and determination could build something my family had declared unworthy of investment. I left work early and drove to Great Neck, past the familiar streets of my childhood, past the houses that all looked the same expensive way, until I pulled into the driveway of the home where I'd learned that some daughters were worth more than others. Emily's wedding portraits dominated the entryway. professional photos in expensive frames, each one capturing a moment from the reception that had cost twice my fertility treatment. Emily and her Vera Wang, dad beaming with pride, mom crying those perfect tears. The Barnes family at their finest, celebrating the daughter who'd done everything right. I found them in the living room. Dad with his evening bourbon, mom flipping through the wedding album they'd received from the photographer, reliving a day that had already started fading from memory despite costing more than most people's annual salary. "Kennedy," mom said, surprise evident in her voice. "I didn't visit often anymore. Not since I'd learned that my presence was tolerated but not valued. We weren't expecting you." I didn't sit down, didn't accept the offer of wine or coffee or whatever hospitality they extended to daughters who showed up unannounced. I just pulled the sonogram photo from my purse and placed it on the coffee table, next to the wedding album that documented $180,000 of excess. "What is this?" Dad asked, setting down his bourbon to pick up the image. "A sonogram. 8 weeks, 3 days. Due in February." My voice was steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "You told me $90,000 for IVF was gambling. That some women aren't meant to be mothers. That I needed to accept my limitations gracefully." Mom's face had gone pale, her perfectly manicured hand frozen on the wedding album. Dad stared at the sonogram like it was evidence of something he hadn't expected to see. "You're pregnant?" Mom asked, her voice carrying that careful neutrality that meant she was calculating how this fit into the family narrative they'd constructed. "I'm pregnant. 10 months after you refused to help, 9 months after you spent twice that amount on Emily's wedding. I made this happen without you. Without your money, without your blessing or your approval or your belief that my dream was worth investing in." I pulled out my phone, scrolling to the GoFundMe page that had funded my treatment. Strangers gave me $5 and $10 and $20. Friends shared my story. Marcus worked 3 jobs. I served coffee to people who'll never know they helped fund someone's last chance at motherhood. And we did it. We raised $90,000 while you were arguing about whether the ice sculptures should be swans or doves. Dad set the sonogram down carefully, like it might shatter. "Kennedy, we couldn't have known." "You could have believed me," I interrupted. "When I told you this was my last realistic chance, when I showed you the medical documentation, when I begged you to help me have a child who would be your grandchild. You could have believed that my dream mattered as much as Emily's wedding." I looked at the framed portraits surrounding us, the visual evidence of what the Barnes family valued. "You spent $180,000 on flowers that died in 2 days, on a dress that was worn once, on champagne that was consumed and forgotten. I spent $90,000 on a heartbeat that will live for generations." The silence that followed felt different from the refusal 9 months earlier. This wasn't them dismissing my request. This was them confronting the reality that I'd succeeded without them, that strangers had believed in me more than my own blood had. "We're happy for you," Mom said finally, the words sounding rehearsed and hollow. "Are you?" I asked. "Or are you just uncomfortable that I proved you wrong, that the daughter you dismissed as not meant for motherhood is going to become a mother anyway?" Emily appeared in the doorway then, still wearing her work clothes from the consulting firm, her face carrying that expression of polished confidence that had defined our entire relationship. "What's going on?" I picked up the sonogram, holding it where she could see. "I'm pregnant. Due in February. Funded entirely without family help, since they were busy paying for your wedding. They'd thought legacy was built with $180,000 and a wedding that made them look good. But real legacy was sleeping in the bassinet next to me, funded by $90,000 that had been harder to raise but infinitely more valuable to spend. And no one, not my parents, not Emily, not anyone who dismissed my dream as unworthy, could deny that anymore. If Kennedy's story resonated with you, if you've ever been told your dreams weren't worth investing in while watching a sibling get everything, if you've ever funded your own miracle after family called it gambling, you understand why this story needed to be told. Hit that like button if you've ever been the daughter whose needs were dismissed while a sibling's wants were celebrated. Subscribe and turn on notifications because next week we're sharing Marcus's story, a man whose parents funded his brother's startup 3 times while refusing to help with his adoption fees. His response will restore your faith in chosen family over biological obligation. Now here's something I'm really curious about. Where are you watching this from? Drop a comment with your city or state. I'm wondering if we have viewers from all across the country or if certain areas really connect with Kennedy's story. Are you watching from New York like Kennedy? California? Texas? Florida? Let's see how far this story has reached and maybe we'll find some neighbors in the comments. Kennedy spent $90 kelvins on a heartbeat that will live for generations. Her family spent $180 kelvins on flowers that died in 2 days. The math speaks for itself. Build your legacy. Fund your dreams. And remember that the best families aren't always the ones you're born into. They're the ones who show up when it matters most.